Grace thought her story would end on that dusty Texas road, abandoned by her own family, alone in the scorching heat with nothing but a small suitcase and a silver locket. Exhausted, she pushed open the door of a stranger's ranch, and what she saw on those walls made her stop breathing. Her own face, hundreds of times, every age, every season, every version of herself she had ever been, painted by someone who had been watching her life from a distance for longer than she could imagine. She had no idea who lived in that ranch. She had no idea what those paintings meant, but the answer, when it came, would change everything she thought she knew about her own past and destroy the man who had stolen her future. If you believe that real love never truly disappears, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories that prove it. Now, let's begin. Grace Calloway had lived in the house on Meridian Hill for 51 years, which meant she had lived there longer than most of the oak trees in the front garden, longer than the town of Harwick. Texas had had its current post office, and longer than any of her neighbors had lived anywhere. She had arrived as a bride of 27, on a June morning when the Texas heat was already serious by 9 in the morning, and the house had looked to a woman who had grown up in modest circumstances, like something from a world she had only seen in magazines. The house had been in the Calloway family for 3 generations. Edward's grandfather had built it in 1901, with the proceeds of a cattle operation that had been successful enough to leave a mark on the landscape, and the mark he had chosen was a house of 14 rooms, with wraparound porches on both floors and a garden that required, in its high season, 3 full-time gardeners to maintain. It was not the largest house in Harwick County. It was the most loved. Edward had understood this, and had maintained it accordingly, and Grace had loved it the way you love something that was given to you as a gift you did not expect, and worked every day to be worthy of. She had been worthy of it. She had managed its household through 50 years of seasons, the practical management of a large property that required constant attention and a particular kind of love to do well, rather than merely adequately. She had raised her stepdaughter Caroline in its rooms, had watched Caroline grow from a difficult child who did not know what to make of a new stepmother into a woman who called every Sunday. She had opened the house's doors for the community events and charitable functions and holiday gatherings that were part of what a house like this owed to the place it stood in, had made the house a place the community recognized as genuinely open rather than performing openness, which was a distinction that took decades to establish and that Grace had understood from the beginning. She had kept the garden as Edward's grandmother had designed it, the rose borders and the kitchen garden, and the old oak trees that shaded the east porch in the afternoon, and she had added to it over the years the additions of a woman who understood plants, and understood permanence and intended to stay. Edward had died 3 years ago. This was the loss that everything since had been organized around, the fact beneath all the other facts. He had died in the bedroom where his father had died before him, in the particular way of men who have always been at home in a place, quietly, without drama, at 81 years old, having had the kind of life that does not require a dramatic ending. Grace had held his hand. She had been holding it for 50 years, and she held it at the end. What came after was not quiet. Edward's son from his first marriage, Thomas Calloway, 53 years old, a man who had spent his adult life in Dallas doing the kind of business that required good suits and flexible ethics, had arrived for the funeral with an attorney and departed 3 days later, with a set of documents that he said needed Grace's signature for estate administration purposes. She had signed them. She had been in the particular state of grief that makes paperwork feel like an intrusion from a world that has not understood what has happened, and she had signed what was put in front of her, the way you sign things when you are not fully present for the signing. She had not read them carefully enough. She was a woman who read documents carefully under normal circumstances, had always been, had managed the household finances and the correspondence of a busy household with the methodical attention of someone who understands that details matter. But the weeks after Edward's death had not been normal circumstances, and Thomas had known this, and the timing had not been accidental. The understanding of what she had signed came slowly over the following months, as Thomas became more present in the management of the estate's affairs, and her own access to those affairs became more limited. An attorney she did not know began handling matters that had always been handled by the family's longtime attorney, who had retired, and whose successor was, it emerged, someone Thomas had selected. Letters arrived with language that became progressively more specific about the terms of Edward's estate and Grace's position within it. By the time Grace understood clearly what Thomas had done, the process was already advanced. The documents she had signed had included, buried in the language of estate administration, a transfer of specific property rights that effectively removed her claim to primary residence at Calloway House. Thomas had not forged signatures. He had been more careful than that. He had presented documents to a grieving widow in a state where her attention and judgment were compromised, and the documents had been what they were. She had fought it immediately, and with everything she had, which was more than Thomas had expected. She had found her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Wells, recommended by the minister of her church who had known her for 30 years and who had said quietly that if Grace needed someone who would not be intimidated, he knew exactly who to call. Patricia Wells had looked at the documents with the focused attention of someone recognizing a pattern she had seen before, and had said, with the careful language of a professional who does not promise what she cannot guarantee, that the case was complex and the timeline was difficult. She had also said that complex cases with strong underlying facts, given sufficient time, tended to find their way to correct outcomes. The timeline ran out on a Thursday morning in August. Thomas arrived at 9 with 2 men she did not know, and a locksmith and the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific morning for a long time. He was not cruel in his manner, had apparently decided that efficiency was more appropriate than cruelty, which Grace recognized as a kind of calculation that was in some ways worse than anger. He told her she had 2 hours. He told her there was a car waiting. He told her that arrangements had been made for her comfort and care at a facility that would suit her needs. She packed what she could in 2 hours, which was less than a person needs and more than she had expected to be capable of packing, while Thomas's men moved through the house with the systematic attention of people performing an inventory. She packed the photographs and Henry's, Edward's, personal items and the quilt her mother had made, and the silver locket that had been her grandmother's, the one she had worn every day for 50 years. She packed 1 suitcase and a small bag. She did not pack the roses, she could not pack the garden. She stood in the doorway of the east porch and looked at the oak trees that shaded it in the afternoon, and she thought about every afternoon she had sat under them, and she understood that some things could not be carried and had to be left, and she left them. The car was a dark sedan. Thomas drove. She sat in the back with her suitcase and her small bag and the silver locket around her neck, and she watched Harwick pass outside the window, the street she had driven for 50 years, the people she had known, the church where she had sat in the same pew every Sunday, and she understood that she was passing through it rather than being in it, the way you pass through places in dreams. Thomas drove west, then south, then onto roads that were less familiar, then onto roads that were not familiar at all, the flat Texas landscape opening up around them, the highway giving way to smaller roads, and the smaller roads giving way to a state route that ran through country she did not recognize, scrubby and dry under the August sun, with a particular emptiness of land that is not on the way to anywhere. She asked where they were going. Thomas said they were almost there. He turned onto a road that was barely a road, 2 tracks through the dry grass, and drove for perhaps half a mile and stopped the car. He got out. He opened her door. He put her suitcase on the ground beside her and her small bag beside the suitcase. Then he got back in the car and drove away. She stood on the road and watched the car until it disappeared, and then she stood for a while longer in the August heat, with the dust settling around her and the silence of that particular Texas country, which was not a quiet silence, but a present one, filled with the sounds of insects and the occasional far-off bird and the dry wind moving through the grass. She was 78 years old, and she was standing on a road she did not know in a part of Texas She could not identify with one suitcase and a small bag and a silver locket. She picked up the suitcase. She picked up the small bag. She began to walk. She walked for what she estimated was 20 minutes, though time in August heat moves differently than time in more hospitable conditions, and it may have been longer. She walked in the direction that seemed most likely to lead somewhere, following the road rather than leaving it, because leaving the road in country she did not know seemed like exchanging one problem for several others. The heat was serious. She had lived in Texas for 50 years and understood August heat with the familiarity of long acquaintance, but understanding it and standing in it without shade or water at 78 years old were different things. She walked steadily, with the methodical pace of someone who has decided to continue and is not revisiting the decision, and she held the silver locket between her fingers as she walked in the way she held it when she needed something to hold. The locket had been her grandmother's. Inside it was a photograph of her grandmother as a young woman, 20 perhaps, in the formal style of photographs from that era, the serious expression of someone who had been told to hold still and had held still with the particular dignity of a person who does everything with full commitment. On the back of the locket, engraved in the script of another century, were 4 words her grandmother had lived by and had pressed into Grace's hands along with the locket when Grace was 12 years old. Keep going. She had carried those 4 words for 66 years. She kept going now. The ranch appeared around a curve in the road, set back from the 2-track behind a fence line of cedar posts and a gate that stood open. The gate was the kind of gate that had been built to last, heavy iron, well-maintained, swinging on hinges that had been properly cared for. Through it, a gravel drive led to a low, wide ranch house built from the native limestone of that part of Texas, long and substantial with a covered porch running its full length. Behind the house, several outbuildings. Beyond them, a windmill turning in the hot wind, a water tank, the particular order of a working property that has been managed with consistent attention over many years. There were no vehicles visible, no sign of movement. She pushed through the open gate. It swung easily, recently oiled, and walked up the gravel drive to the porch. She knocked on the front door. She waited. She knocked again. She called out. No response came. The door was not locked. This was not unusual in this part of Texas, where distances between neighbors were measured in miles rather than feet, and the social compact around unlocked doors was different from what it was in cities. She pushed it open 6 inches and called again into the interior. Silence. She pushed the door fully open and stepped inside to get out of the heat, and she turned to look at the room she had entered, and she stopped. The front room of the ranch house was large and simply furnished, a wooden floor, a stone fireplace, plain furniture of good quality arranged without fussiness. There was a workbench along one wall with the organized tools of a craftsman. There were shelves of books. There was a large skylight that filled the room with the particular quality of north-facing natural light. And the walls. Every wall of the room was covered with paintings. Not arranged in the curated way of a collection, not spaced and lit and labeled, but covering the walls the way a life covers the walls of a space lived in for a long time, hung close together, floor nearly to ceiling, framed and unframed, oils and watercolors and drawings, large and small, in every medium and scale. Every painting was of the same woman. Grace stood in the doorway of the room and looked at herself. There she was at 20, in the garden of her parents' house, kneeling beside a rose bush with her hands in the soil. There she was in her 30s, at what appeared to be a formal event, laughing at something someone had said. There she was walking on a beach, her shoes in her hand, the water at her feet. There she was in profile, reading. There she was in 3/4 view, looking at something in the distance with an expression she did not recognize as one she made, but that seemed, looking at it, deeply true. There were hundreds of them. She stood in the doorway of the room and looked at her own face, looking back at her from every wall, and the suitcase dropped from her hand without her intending to drop it, and she walked forward into the room, and she turned slowly, taking it all in, and she began to weep, not from fear, not from confusion, from something that did not have a simple name, The shock of being seen completely by someone she could not yet identify, of understanding that someone had spent a very long time looking at her, holding her in attention, preserving versions of her she had not known were being preserved, of standing inside the evidence of a love she had not known existed. She was still standing in the center of the room, her face wet, when she heard the door open behind her. He was, she would think later, exactly what she would have expected him to become, if she had been allowed to expect anything. She had thought about this in the 57 years since, had thought about it against her will, in the private moments that are hardest to control, the moments just before sleep, or just after waking when the mind goes where it goes without asking permission. She had thought, if he had lived, what would he have become? She had never been able to answer the question because the answer required knowing him at 23 and projecting forward, and the projection was always limited by what she had not known about who he would choose to be. The boy she had known at 22 had been lean and serious, and had moved with the particular economy of someone who worked with his hands and had learned to make every motion count. The man who stood in the doorway of the ranch house was 79 years old and had the same quality, the same economy, the same seriousness, the same careful attention in his face. His hair was white. His hands were large and weathered. His eyes were exactly the same. He stopped when he saw her. He had not known she was coming, could not have known she was coming, and the expression that crossed his face was the expression of someone receiving something they had stopped allowing themselves to believe was possible. Grace, he said, just her name, after 57 years. She had believed he was dead. This was the fact she had carried for 57 years without examining it, because examining it had not been survivable. Her father had told her, at 22 in the library of her parents' house, the summer after she had understood that what she felt for Samuel Reyes, the gardener's son, who had been part of her world since childhood, was not a passing thing, but the central thing. Her father had told her that Samuel had been in an accident, that he was gone, that it was a tragedy, and she should pray for his family, and she should also understand that the association had never been appropriate, and that it was time to think clearly about her future. She had believed him. She had been 22, and she had trusted her father in the absolute way of someone who has not yet had reason not to, and she had believed him because the alternative was unthinkable in a way that was not a figure of speech. The alternative, that her father had looked at her and told her with the steady voice of a man who believed he was right, that the person she loved was dead, when that person was alive and had been sent away by that same man, was not a thought her mind had been capable of forming. She had loved her father. She had trusted him. She had believed him. She had married Edward Calloway 3 years later. She had loved Edward, had loved him genuinely, in the way of a person who has decided to love fully whatever life has given them, and has carried through on that decision for 50 years. Edward had been a good man, and their life had been a good life. She did not qualify this, it was true, and Samuel had been alive the entire time. He told her the rest of it slowly, sitting across from her in the room full of her faces, with the afternoon light coming through the skylight and the particular quiet of a ranch in the middle of the Texas hill country, which is a quiet that has depth to it, not the absence of sound but the presence of space. He told it the way you tell things that have been held for a very long time and must be released carefully, one piece at a time, giving the other person room to absorb each part before the next arrives. Her father had not told him she was dead, had done something in some ways worse, which was to pay him to leave and to tell him that Grace had decided their friendship was not something she wished to continue, had given him money and a threat, and the clear understanding that remaining in Harwick County was not an option. He had been 23. He had left. He had gone to San Antonio, then to New Mexico, then eventually to this piece of land in the Texas hill country that he had purchased with years of accumulated savings, and the income from work he had found, and the proceeds of paintings he had sold under a name that was not his own. He had learned to paint, had taught himself over years the way he taught himself everything, methodically and without shortcuts, and what he had painted was what he remembered, what he had never stopped remembering. He had not known she was married. He had not known anything about her life after the morning he drove out of Harwick County with everything he owned in the back of a borrowed truck. The paintings were not surveillance. They were memory. The face of someone he had loved at 23 and had never found a reason to replace with anything else. Grace sat in the chair he brought for her, and she listened to all of it with the stillness of someone absorbing information that reorganizes everything. She was 78 years old, and she had believed this man was dead for 57 years, and he was sitting across from her in the house he had built with his own hands, telling her he had never left her. Not really, not the way that counted. She held the silver locket. "My father told me you died," she said. "I know," Samuel said. "I understood that eventually. It took me years." "I would have come," she said, "if I had known." "I know that too," he said. "Eventually I knew that too." They sat together in the room full of her faces, and they were both quiet for a while, in the way of people who have a great deal to say and understand that there is no urgency now. He made her tea. She did not want tea but accepted it, because accepting tea was something her body knew how to do when her mind was occupied elsewhere, and her mind was very occupied elsewhere. She walked through the room again, slowly, looking at the paintings with the particular attention of someone looking at themselves from outside, the disorienting experience of seeing your own face as others see it, without the control you have over a mirror. She recognized some of the moments. The rose bush at her parents' house, she had forgotten that garden entirely, and here it was. The specific shape of the beds and the particular rose she had been tending, remembered by someone else with more fidelity than she herself had managed. The beach. She had walked that beach with her friend Caroline the summer she was 34, the summer she had been trying to make sense of something she could not make sense of. She had not thought of that afternoon in decades. Samuel had painted it from what she realized must have been a distance, from the dunes perhaps, the two women small against the water, and yet her posture was exact, her way of carrying her shoes in her left hand. She had been seen her whole life without knowing she was being seen. "How did you—" she began. "I came back sometimes," he said. He said it simply, without apology. "Not to be near you, not to disturb anything, just to—" He stopped. "I needed to know you were there, that you were all right. I would drive through Harwick sometimes and see you in the garden or at the market. I never spoke to you. I never let you see me. I just—" "Painted me," she said. "Yes." She looked at a painting of herself that she estimated was from her late 50s. She recognized the cardigan she had worn constantly that decade, the one she had finally given away when it became unwearable. She was in the garden, her back to the painter, her hands in the roses. "I had no idea," she said. "I know." He sat down. "I'm sorry if it disturbs you. I understand if it does." She thought about this, honestly. She looked at the walls, at the hundreds of versions of herself, at the life she had lived, reflected back at her through the attention of someone who had never stopped paying it. "It doesn't disturb me," she said. "It makes me feel something I don't have a word for." He nodded. He seemed to understand this. She asked about the paintings he had sold. He was careful about this, the care of someone who has never spoken easily about money, who grew up in circumstances where money was not spoken about because there was rarely enough of it to warrant discussion, and who had arrived at financial security through work rather than inheritance, and regarded that security as something to be maintained quietly. But she pressed gently, because she needed to understand the full picture of what she was looking at, and because she had spent 50 years managing financial realities and was not going to stop now. He had sold, over 50 years, several hundred paintings. Not of her. Those he had never sold had never considered selling. He painted other subjects, the landscape of the hill country, the particular quality of Texas light, the faces of people he encountered in his life. He had developed, under the name he had taken when he left Harwick County, a reputation that had grown slowly and then significantly. He was represented by galleries in Austin and Houston and Santa Fe. A retrospective of his work had been held at the San Antonio Museum of Art 4 years ago. One of his paintings, a landscape, the hill country at dawn, was in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. And one other thing. He said it quietly, watching her face. There was a painting in a private collection in Dallas, a portrait, a woman in three-quarter view looking at something in the distance, that had been purchased at auction for an amount that had surprised even his gallery. The buyer had never known the subject's name. The painting was titled simply Grace, which was also a common noun, and the buyer had assumed it referred to the quality of the figure rather than the identity. Grace sat with this for a moment. Her face had been in Dallas for 11 years, in a collector's home admired by people who did not know who she was. She thought about Thomas, who was at this moment presumably back in Harwick County, believing he had solved his problem by abandoning a 78-year-old woman on a dirt road in August. She thought about Patricia Wells, who had said the case was complex and the timeline was difficult. She thought about the phrase Samuel had used, a reputation that had grown significantly. "Do you have a lawyer?" she said. The attorney's name was Robert Vance, and he came to the ranch 2 days after Grace arrived, 2 days during which he slept in the spare room of the house Samuel had built and ate the meals he cooked with the quiet competence of someone who has lived alone for a long time and has made peace with his own company, and walked the property in the mornings when the heat was not yet serious, and began, slowly and without forcing it, to understand the shape of where she was. The property was 40 acres. Samuel had purchased it 30 years ago when the land in this part of the hill country was less expensive than it had since become. With money saved over the preceding years of painting and doing the ranch work that had been his primary income before the painting. Income made it unnecessary. He had built the main house himself, the limestone walls, the cedar framing, the roof, with occasional help from neighbors who worked the way neighbors work in rural Texas, practically and without fuss. The studio was separate from the house, attached to it by a covered walkway that Samuel had built from the same cedar as the house's interior framing, a detail she noticed and recognized as the habit of a person who cares about coherence in what they make. It was a single large room with north-facing skylights that filled the space with the particular quality of light that painters have always sought, even, consistent, without the drama of direct sun, and the organized surfaces of a workspace that has been in constant use for decades. The organization was not the organization of someone who has arranged a space to look orderly. It was the organization of someone who knows where everything is, because everything has been used and returned to its place 10,000 times. Grace walked through it on the second morning and looked at the canvases stacked along one wall, the completed work that had not yet gone to the gallery, and she understood for the first time the full scale of what Samuel had been doing in this isolated place for 30 years. The paintings were extraordinary. She had no technical vocabulary for painting, but she had lived with beautiful things long enough to recognize them, and these were beautiful in the particular way of things that have been made with complete attention and absolute honesty. She found, in the corner of the studio, a small canvas that was not stacked with the others. It was propped on an easel facing the wall. She turned it. It was a painting of two young people in a garden. She was 22 and he was 23, and they were sitting on the garden wall at her parents' house in the late afternoon, and the light was the specific light of that summer, and their postures were the postures of people who are entirely comfortable in each other's presence. She had not known anyone had seen that afternoon. She had not known anyone had painted it. She set the canvas back on the easel, facing out, and she went to find Samuel. Robert Vance arrived at 11 in the morning in a truck that had seen better decades, and wore the boots of someone who works in this part of the state. He was perhaps 60, with the unhurried manner of a man who has handled complicated situations for long enough to understand that hurrying them rarely helps. He listened to Grace's account of the documents, the estate, Thomas, and the Thursday morning on the road, and he listened to Samuel's description of the financial and legal resources available to him, and then he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone organizing information. Then he asked for copies of every document Grace had retained. She had retained more than Thomas had expected. In the 2 hours she had been given to pack, she had had the presence of mind, the specific presence of mind of a woman who had managed a household and its affairs for 50 years, to take from the desk in Edward's study the folder that contained the copies of estate documents she had been keeping since the process began. She had put the folder in her small bag, along with the photographs and the quilt and the locket, and the folder was now on Robert Vance's lap. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. "There's a will," he said when he finished. Not a question. "Patricia Wells believed there might be," Grace said, "but we could not." "There's a will," he said again. He held up a document. "This reference, in this administrative filing, this is citing a document that doesn't match the will that was submitted for probate. The document numbers don't correspond, which means there are two documents, which means one of them was suppressed." Grace looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Grace. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," Robert said with the careful precision of someone who has been in this profession long enough to be accurate rather than dramatic, "that if there is a second will, which I believe there is, and if that will contains provisions that differ from the one probated, then the process that transferred the property rights was built on a document that may not be the controlling instrument." He set the papers down. "It means Thomas Calloway may have made a very significant error. The second will was found in the offices of Edward's longtime attorney, the one who had retired, found not by searching his active files, but by contacting him directly, which Robert Vance did the morning after his first visit to the ranch. The retired attorney, a man named George Hartwell, who was 81 years old and had practiced law in Harwick County for 45 years, had been waiting for someone to call. He said this plainly, without elaboration, when Robert reached him, that he had prepared a will for Edward Calloway in the final year of his life, that he had given a copy to Edward and retained a copy himself, and that the will he had prepared had not been the one submitted for probate. He had not come forward because, he said this with the careful honesty of a man in the final accounting of a long career, he had not been certain that coming forward was his place to occupy. He had drafted the document. He had done his part. What happened after was between the family and the courts. He had told himself this, and had not entirely believed it, and had been relieved when the phone rang. The will George Hartwell had prepared left the Calloway property and its associated estate entirely to Grace, with specific provisions that acknowledged Thomas's interests through a separate financial arrangement that Edward had structured carefully and which Thomas had chosen to set aside in favor of what he apparently believed was a simpler approach. Robert Vance submitted the document to the probate court on a Tuesday morning with the focused efficiency of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has recognized it. He submitted simultaneously a detailed complaint to the State Bar of Texas regarding the attorney Thomas had used, whose involvement in the preparation and submission of the earlier document raised questions that Robert described, in the formal language of the complaint, as warranting thorough examination. He also contacted the Harwick County Sheriff's Office, where a deputy he had known professionally for 20 years listened to his account of the Thursday morning road abandonment, a 78-year-old woman, August heat, an unmarked dirt road, no water, no transportation, with the expression of someone hearing something that makes their job feel unusually clear and straightforward. Thomas Calloway was arrested on a Friday. He was charged with fraud, elder abuse, and the abandonment of a vulnerable adult, the last charge specific to Texas law, and carrying consequences that the attorney he retained described to him privately as significant. The case that followed was not brief, but its direction was clear from the beginning, and Thomas understood this within the first week. Grace was not present for the arrest. She was at the ranch in the studio, watching Samuel work on a commission that had been waiting for his attention while the legal situation resolved. A landscape for a collector in Austin who had been patient about the delay in a way that Samuel said was characteristic of people who genuinely loved the work rather than the idea of owning the work. Grace was asking him questions about technique, specifically about the way he mixed the particular blue-gray of the hill country sky in late afternoon, and he was answering with the patience of someone who has never minded being asked to explain what he loves, which is to say with no patience limit at all. She had spent 50 years managing a house and its household, and she had done this well and gladly, But she had not spent 50 years doing something that was entirely hers, something that lived in her hands and her attention and no one else's. And watching Samuel work had introduced her to what that might feel like. She was 78 years old. It was not too late to find out. The legal resolution of the estate took 7 months. Patricia Wells, who had always believed the case was winnable given time, worked with Robert Vance through the process with the focused efficiency of two people who understand each other's work. By March of the following year, the Callaway property had been returned to Grace's ownership, and Thomas had exhausted his legal options and begun the longer process of dealing with his criminal exposure. Grace visited Callaway House once on a Thursday in April, with Samuel beside her, and Robert Vance's confirmation that the visit was legally uncomplicated. She walked through the rooms with the particular attention of someone taking a last inventory rather than a homecoming. The house was the house. She went to the east porch and sat for a while in the place she had sat for 50 years and looked at the oak trees, letting herself be in it fully. She went to the garden and looked at the roses, which had been maintained in her absence. The caretaker Thomas had installed had, whatever else could be said about his choices, had the sense to hire someone who knew roses. She found the particular one by the east gate that she had planted in 1989, and that had never failed her in 35 years. Then she walked out through the front gate and got in the car with Samuel and drove back to the ranch. She had understood something in those rooms that she needed to understand in person rather than at a distance, that the house was a house, and the life she had lived in it was the life she had lived in it, and those things were real and permanent in the way that past things are permanent. The house was also a property with a market value, and a set of responsibilities attached to it, and a history that included Thomas and everything Thomas had done and represented, and she did not need to live inside that history anymore. She listed it with a realtor the following week, a woman who had sold properties in Harwick County for 30 years and who walked through Callaway House with the professional attention of someone cataloguing assets and emerged from the tour with an expression that said she understood what the house was worth, and also that she understood something about the woman who was selling it. She had said nothing unnecessary. Grace had appreciated this. The sale of Callaway House closed on a June morning, one of those Texas June mornings that arrives early with its intentions clear, and Grace sat at the kitchen table of the ranch house and held the paper that confirmed the number and felt the particular quality of a large decision that has been correctly made. She had already decided where it was going. Not all of it. She was 78 years old, and she was practical about the fact that 78-year-old women need financial security, and that sentimentality about money was a luxury she could not afford and did not want. A portion would be held in a trust that Robert Vance and Patricia Wells had structured to ensure her security regardless of what the future held. The rest she had directed, with the specificity of someone who has thought about this carefully, to 3 organizations: a children's home in Harwick County that had been operating for 40 years on funding that was never quite sufficient, a scholarship fund at the community college in the nearest town, and the beginnings of something that was not yet an organization, but would be. The something was Samuel's idea, offered carefully in the way he offered things, not as a plan he had already decided on, but as a question he was genuinely asking. He had land, he had a studio, he had 50 years of knowledge about how to teach a hand and an eye to work together towards something true. He had been, he said, painting alone for a long time, and he thought he might like to paint with other people. The Reyes Arts Foundation was formally established in September, with the legal structure Robert Vance had helped them build over the summer, the bylaws, the board, the non-profit status that would allow them to receive grants and donations from the organization Samuel's reputation had been attracting attention from for years. It opened in the studio attached to the ranch house, with 6 students in the first cohort, young people from the surrounding area between 16 and 22, identified through conversations with the community college counselors and the art teacher at the high school in town as people who were making art without resources or instruction, or the knowledge that what they were making had any value beyond their own private relationship with it. Samuel taught them 4 days a week, with the focused attention he brought to everything, and Grace managed the administrative reality of the foundation with the focused attention she brought to everything, and they discovered, in the process, that the complementary nature of what each of them brought to a shared project was something they had perhaps always been designed for. The foundation received a grant in October from a Dallas arts organization whose director had seen Samuel's retrospective in San Antonio and had been looking for an opportunity to be involved in his work. The grant was significant, and the director, when he visited the ranch in November, spent an hour in the studio looking at the paintings on the walls of the front room, the hundreds of paintings of Grace, which Samuel had not taken down and did not intend to, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "This needs to be shown." Samuel looked at Grace. Grace looked at Samuel. "Not sold," Samuel said. "No," the director agreed. "Shown. There's a difference." The exhibition opened the following spring at a gallery on Congress Avenue in Austin, in a space that had the particular quality of galleries that take their work seriously. Good light, considered spacing, the quiet that invites looking. The title was Grace, a portrait in time, which Samuel had chosen after considerable thought, and which Grace had accepted after her own considerable thought, understanding that her name was also a word with other meanings, and that the double meaning was not something to avoid, but something the work earned. It consisted of 47 of the paintings Samuel had made over 50 years, arranged chronologically: Grace at 22 in the garden, Grace at 34 on the beach, Grace at 50 in profile, Grace at 70 looking at something in the distance, with the expression that had always seemed to Samuel like the truest thing he had ever painted. The opening was attended by people from the Austin arts community and by several Harwick County residents who had known Grace for decades and who stood in front of the paintings with the expression of people recognizing something they had known without knowing they knew it. Grace stood in the center of the gallery and looked at her own life on the walls and felt for the second time the particular thing she had felt in the ranch house on the August afternoon she had first walked through the door. The thing that did not have a simple name. The thing that was close to being known completely. Samuel stood beside her. He had held her hand for the first time in 57 years, the week after she arrived at the ranch, in the careful way of someone who understands that some gestures require the other person to be ready for them, and she had been ready, and they had not let go since. On an evening in late October, one of the evenings that arrives in the Texas Hill Country in this season, with the quality of a gift, cool enough for a sweater after the long heat of summer, the light on the cedars, and the limestone doing what it does in October when the angle is right, Grace sat on the covered porch of the ranch house and watched the hills go gold in the last hour of daylight. The foundation students had gone for the day. She could hear Samuel in the studio, the particular sounds of someone working with concentration, the movements of a person entirely inside what they are doing. She had learned in the month since arriving to recognize these sounds and to feel about them what she felt. The warmth of knowing that the person you love is doing the thing that makes them most themselves, nearby, reachable if you needed them, and not needing to be reached. She held the silver locket. She opened it and looked at the photograph of her grandmother, 20 years old, serious, the formal posture of the era, and she thought about the words engraved on the back. Keep going. She had kept going. On the road in August, in the full heat of a Texas afternoon, with one suitcase and a locket and no clear direction, she had kept going. She had walked through an open gate and into a room full of her own face, and she had kept going. Through Robert Vance and the probate court, and the sale of the house and the establishment of the foundation, and all the days since, she had kept going. She was 78 years old, and she was not nearly finished. The foundation had 12 students now, which was twice what they had started with, and which had required a reorganization of the teaching schedule that Samuel had managed with the creative disregard for scheduling of a man who had lived alone for decades, and which Grace had then reorganized into something that actually worked, and which Samuel had accepted with the good humor of a man who has discovered, late in life, the particular pleasure of being organized by someone who loves you. They were talking about expanding the studio space. Tom Garrett, the builder Samuel had worked with before, had looked at the site on a Thursday morning and said the expansion was straightforward from a construction standpoint. Grace had looked at the numbers that same evening and said it was straightforward from a financial standpoint. They were in agreement. They were in agreement on most things she had discovered. Not everything. They had specific and sometimes spirited disagreements about the management of the foundation's administrative calendar, which Samuel approached with the creative disregard for scheduling of a man who had lived alone for decades, and which Grace approached with the structured attention of a woman who had managed a 14-room house. They were working on it. Thomas Calloway had accepted a plea agreement in August. Grace did not follow the proceedings closely, had asked Robert Vance to keep her informed of significant developments and to handle the rest, which he did with the efficiency she had come to rely on. The terms were what they were, and the prosecutor had invited her to make a statement at the sentencing which she had declined. Not from forgiveness exactly. She was honest with herself about the difference between forgiveness and the decision not to invest further energy in a direction, but from the understanding that everything that needed to be said had been said in the documents in the courtroom, and that adding her voice would not change what had happened and would cost her something she preferred to spend elsewhere. The Harwick County Children's Home had received its donation in July and had used a portion of it to hire 2 additional staff members and repair the roof of the residential wing, which had needed attention for 3 years. The director had called Grace to thank her and had mentioned that the children called the new common room the Calloway Room, which Grace had felt about in a way that was complicated and ultimately peaceful. She had not gone back to Harwick after the April visit. She had not needed to, and she had found in the months since that the absence of need was itself a kind of freedom she had not expected to feel so cleanly. She had lived in Harwick for 50 years, and during those 50 years it had been, simply and completely, where she was, the center of the map, the place everything else was measured from. Now it was somewhere she had been, somewhere that had made her who she was, and that she had left. The distinction was not small, and she had spent some weeks quietly learning to feel it as the freedom it was. The paintings Samuel had given her, the 2 of them on the garden wall, the summer light of a specific afternoon 57 years ago, their postures, the postures of people who did not know they were being observed because no one had been observing them, or so they had believed, hung in the bedroom of the ranch house on the wall directly across from the bed, positioned so that it was the first thing she saw in the morning when the light came through the east window. She had asked him to take it down once in the 2nd week, when the weight of it was more than she could carry at that particular hour. He had taken it down without question. She had asked him to put it back 3 days later. It was theirs. Both of them were in it. The afternoon it depicted was gone, and the people in it were changed, and the garden where it had happened had been sold with a house she no longer owned, and none of that altered what the painting contained, which was the specific truth of a specific moment that had been held carefully for 57 years and had not been lost. She heard the studio door and Samuel's footsteps on the walkway, and then on the porch boards, and he came and sat in the chair beside her, with the easy movement of someone arriving at a place they belong, and they looked at the hill country together in the last of the October light. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. He reached over and took her hand. The hills went from gold to amber to the particular grey that comes just before dark. A hawk moved slowly along the ridgeline. The windmill turned steadily in the warm evening wind. The foundation students would come back in the morning, and the studio would fill again with the sounds of people learning something that mattered, and the work would continue the way work continues when it is the right work in the right place. Grace held Samuel's hand and the silver locket and watched the last light leave the hills, the gold going to amber, going to the deep blue-gray that this part of Texas produced in the half-hour after sunset, the color Samuel had been trying to paint correctly for 30 years, and that she had watched him work on since arriving, and that she thought he was getting closer to, though she kept this observation to herself for now. She felt what she felt, the full weight of everything it had taken to arrive here, and beneath the weight the particular quality of having arrived somewhere that was genuinely worth it. That would go on being worth it, and that was hers. If Grace's story touched you in any way, hit that like button so this story of love and resilience can reach more people who need hope today. A warm embrace to each and every one of you. Until next time, I'll see you in the next story.